African American figureheads such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Elaine Leroy Locke encouraged and inspired an artistic wave of black expressionism in Harlem, New York, redefining African American artistic liberation as triumphant from a time of tragic discrimination and aggression committed towards the black community to the era of black equality and economic prosperity across the United States. In the South, where most of the black population in America had resided, there was an intense bigotry as well as an economic and social repression against the black community. In the South, one of the only jobs for black people were tenant farming and sharecropping. These institutions were created as a replacement to slavery. It created a vicious cycle of debt in which the worker was bound to the sharecropper's land until they could pay off their debt or get enough money to live off on their own. If you met our quota in crop production, you didn't have debt, and you were no longer a slave.
As if the economic restraints weren't already debilitating, after the Plessy versus Ferguson case, Jim Crow laws in the South made it legal for whites to discriminate against non-whites. This meant jobs could be restricted to only whites, which almost forced African Americans to resort to sharecropping and tenant farming. Coinciding with the economic stresses put upon African Americans, there was the tragedy of lynching and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. From 1882 to 1968, over 3,446 African Americans were lynched, although this number could be greater since there was a lot of lynchings that were undocumented. These acts of murder and hate was legal at the time, for they were not restricted nor tried. The Ku Klux Klan was a terrorist group on the rise in the 1920s and terrorized anyone who was black, Jewish, Southern European, Hispanic, or anyone who wasn't 100% American. They had large positions in the American government, sometimes having enough power to govern over states and cities, alter ratified laws, and solidify their own, even controlling Indiana's government in the 1920s. With the trademark symbol of the burning cross left on your line, they were responsible for many lynchings. Even though there was an inescapable institution of intense bigotry in the South, there was some hope shedding in the Northwest.
The Great Migration was the mass migration of African Americans in the U.S. from the South to the North in bigger cities. This was in reaction to World War I taking many white workers from the workforces in the factories of the North. Now that there were less workers, bosses settled with blacks doing jobs that were traditionally white-only occupations. This and the more progressive North in regards to civil rights reform inspired blacks to begin the journey to northern city opportunity. Harlem, New York was one of the outliers in the sense of it being a haven of artistic expressionism, as well as a new sense of professionalism that was uncommon in the black community before. The Harlem Renaissance, formerly known as the New Negro Movement, was a prime example of W.E.B. Du Bois' talented 10 philosophy. It ushered in a new wave of intellect and culture exemplified through the various works of Harlem scholars and artists. Elaine Leroy Locke, the father of the Harlem Renaissance, edited an influential anthology series, The New Negro, which set an exemplar for how the new Negro should go about creating literature and art in the 1920s, combating the white power system of hate with knowledge. In his works, he sets a prime example for how the community should go about positively portraying black culture, encouraging the African American community to challenge their status in American society, in turn establishing an idea of black oneness and excellence. This would be the groundworks for a series of inspiring African American poets, authors, and artists of all kinds to rise in the artistic community.
There was an enormous triumph of great intellectuals and artists in Harlem, New York. Langston Hughes was considered to be the dean of Harlem Renaissance writing. He established a profound voice of rich African traditionalism in his poems. His The Negro Speaks of Rivers echoed the voice of the Harlem Renaissance. Like most of his works, it embodied the African roots present in all African Americans, grounding the notion that black is beautiful. Zora Neale Hurston was another intelligent writer who wrote for the black magazine Fire and found much success outside of the Harlem Renaissance with her book Their Eyes Were Watching God. Her works would dabble in the Negro problem studied by Du Bois, and her famous book would touch on the theme of a black woman's journey through society and her sexuality. Aaron Douglas encapsulated the Harlem Renaissance through his various paintings, demonstrating a unique essence of African heritage, as well as the soul African Americans in Harlem embodied through their music and literature, like Langston Hughes. Oxter Michaud would become the first black film artist whose movies would challenge the established role of black people in America. His movie Within Our Gates, 1920, would directly challenge the racism portrayed in The Birth of a New Nation. Many African American scholars, despite the list of tragic conditions before the Great Migration, were able to prosper because of the ideas of African Americans like W.E.B. Du Bois and Alain Leroy Locke, encouraging mass unification within the black community. This movement would set up a cataclysm of black art and intelligence for the years to come, setting groundbreaking achievements in the black culture that will alter the mindset of Americans, proving that African Americans could be triumphant. And here's Mr. Burton with his take on the Harlem Renaissance.
When I think about the Harlem Renaissance, one of the biggest images that come to mind is the sense of community. You've had black people from all walks of life, all socioeconomic classes, and they were concentrated to an area of New York where you had a mix of culture, you had a mix of, again, of different socioeconomic backgrounds. You had poor people and rich people, you had educated and uneducated people. But the sense of community as far as services, schools, businesses, the arts, the entertainments, the fashion. Black Harlem in the 20s was a cultural phenomenon, and it gave us a lot of people from that era. One of the more known people to come from that is poet Langston Hughes, where he talks about the struggles of growing up in an oppressive culture. You got the music of Billie Holiday and her song Strange Fruit, which talks about lynching, primarily in the South. It also gives you thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois, who talks about the talent and intent that is going to save the black race from death and destruction that comes along with living in a system of oppression.
It's a tragedy of the Harlem Renaissance.
When I spoke of the triumphs, all those triumphs were in spite of the racial oppression that continues to go on in America, but definitely that was going on throughout the 20s. Harlem again thrived in spite of that racial oppression, but with the turn of the century and the economic crash and the Great Depression, that economic depression on top of the racial oppression was more than the Harlem community could stand, and it literally collapsed underneath. So now that all you have would be the poorest of the poor, people who don't have skills to go get gainful employment or to create businesses. And you also have people with the influx of drugs who became addicted to drugs as a result.